Hooker was a businessman here in Los Angeles. He had a nice house over in the West Adams district, and Hale used to go over there and they would have poetry readings and musical performances and salons and things like that. And Hale would talk to Hooker and try to entice him to get involved with the observatory. So Hooker, who didn't have, he had money but he didn't have deep money, agrees to put up $45,000 for the casting of the 100-inch blank. And informally, this telescope is known as the Hooker telescope, even though it hasn't been given that designation. But it's still not enough money. So Hale goes back to Carnegie, and after a lot of wrangling, Carnegie eventually comes up with about $500,000 and makes this place possible. So Saint-Gobain Glassworks is going to cast this blank, and if they cast it successfully, it will be the largest piece of glass in the world. They have a mold big enough and they have a furnace big enough, they don't have a ladle that's big enough. So they have to dip the ladle into the glass, pour it in the mold, dip, pour, Well, in the process of doing that, they get bubbles trapped in the glass, and there's layers. It's like a sloppy layer cake. So they make several tries at it, and eventually the third try they think is pretty good, even though it's got bubbles in it, so they ship it from Paris to here. I believe it went through Houston, shipped over the ocean to Houston, and then by rail to Pasadena, and then to the Pasadena offices of the Carnegie Observatories. And Hale and Ritchie both look at it and say, no, this isn't going to work. Their concern is that the bubbles and the layers will cause the glass to change shape with temperature non-uniformly and throw the figure of the mirror. So Saint-Gobain is told, no, this isn't good enough, you have to do more. So they keep trying. Ritchie even goes to Paris for a year to try to supervise, and ultimately they're not able to produce anything better than what they had already sent. So at that point, Hale and Walter Adams, against George Ritchie's objections, say, okay, well, let's go ahead and let's grind and curve the glass that we have. Now, everything was not all just, roses and butterflies at this time. One of the problems was that Hooker felt that Hale was having an inappropriate relationship with Hooker's wife, Catherine. Now, Catherine was 20 years older than Hale, a charming woman, but no. However, he was having an inappropriate relationship with Catherine's friend, a woman named Alicia Moscow, called Ella. And she and he just got along, and they would do poetry and did dances and all sorts of sort of in the woods kind of things. And eventually Hooker becomes so unhappy with all of this that he says, well, there are no men that can be in my house unless I'm here, and especially not George Ellery Hale. On top of that, Ritchie decides he wants to start his own telescope making company. So he goes to Hooker behind Hale's back and tries to get Hooker to invest in the telescope. Well, there is no betrayal worse to Hale than going after his money sources. So between Ritchie's trying to start his own company with somebody else's money and his general cantankerousness, Ritchie is fired. And so Ritchie doesn't finish the building of this telescope. So the building was designed by D.H. Burnham, the same fellow that designed the 150-foot tower, Chicago architect. The building was designed in Chicago, it was fabricated in Chicago, it was assembled in Chicago to make sure that everything fit and worked. Then it was disassembled, put on flat cars, and shipped out by rail to Pasadena, where it was then schlepped up the toll road, either by mule or by some of the first Mack trucks that were here on the West Coast, who were geared such that their maximum speed was 2 miles an hour.
Wow.
So, over a period of time, the steel came up the hill, hot rivets were made, and all this hot riveted together just as the 150-foot tower is. So let's go upstairs and see what they wrought. They use the handrails.
What extra?
exercise working here, huh?
Okay, come on out.
Now that's smart.
Telescope. Optically, it's the same design as the 60, just scaled up. Where the 60 was about 20 tons, this one is 100 tons of moving stuff. Like the 60-inch, it's supported on a mercury float. There's a tank of mercury right in here, and a second tank of mercury up here. And the float holds about 90% of the weight of the telescope. So the bearings hold a very small amount. That's one of the reasons why the bearings lasted a long time. Also makes it easier to make the bearings that will move smoothly. You don't have so much weight on it. So, on July 1st of 1917, the mirror is done, and the mirror is going to make its trip up the hill to the telescope itself. So they mounted it in a crate, they put it inside one of these early Mack trucks, and because it's July 1st, it's a big holiday. And the mayor comes and speaks, and there's flags and bunting and marching bands and all that stuff, and everybody traipses up the hill with this big telescope mirror inside of a wood box. Fortunately, the mirror did make it up the hill, and after all the hoopla was done, everybody else went downhill, and the mirror was brought inside the building, and for a relatively short period of time, the mirror was brought up to the floor and mounted inside the telescope. So the mirror weighs 4,500 pounds. They removed 500 pounds of glass from it during the grinding and figuring. And so on November 1st, 1917, this telescope is ready for first light. First light's the occasion of the first observation. So Hale, who had been in Hill Health, was invited over for that. It was number 2, Walter Adams, who was active director, was here. George Ritchie was invited back. Alfred Noyes, the poet, was here. And then the rest of the people who were here were mostly the construction workers who put this whole thing together. So it gets to be dark time. Bright object's chosen, the telescope was aimed at the bright object, and Hale's given the chance to be the first person to make the observation. And he steps up the eyepiece, and he looks in. He looks. He steps back and doesn't say anything. So Walter Adams, who was never shy about sharing an opinion, steps up the eyepiece and looks away and says a lot of things we won't repeat here. But the bottom line was, instead of having a nice sharp pinpoint image, fuzzballs. Think of cotton balls spread around, 4, 5, 6 of them. They wouldn't resolve into a single fuzzball, and the fuzzball wouldn't resolve into a sharp star. George Ritchie is furious, saying, I told you if you had paid attention to me and done it my way, it would have worked. But now you spent all this money, and you've got a broken instrument. What are you going to do now? It's your fault. George is easy to get along with. So, discussion ensues, and in the discussion, it comes up from the workers that during the day, the shutters, which are over here, had been opened to let light in, and that sunlight had shone directly onto the telescope. And so it was thought that the sunlight shining on it, the heat from the sun, could have warped the mirror and or warped the structure. So it was decided, okay, we'll let it cool off. We'll all go down to what's called the monastery, which was this little dorm they had there, which is still here, actually. and come back in the early morning to try again. So they do that. I can imagine how much sleep they got. Big hail. They come back 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Another bright object shows him. Telescope to salute over. Hails the first person to look. He looks in. Eureka! Pinpoint star. So now they have the third telescope, the largest telescope in the world, created by George Ellery Hale, and there are no astronomers. Where are the astronomers? Anybody have an idea? No?
Different place.
They were in a different place, but they weren't here. What different place?
Why?
It's 1917. What was going on in 1917?
Oh, the end of World War I.
The Great War. It wasn't World War I yet because we didn't know we had World War II coming up. All the astronomers, everybody in science had gone in to work on the war effort. So, there were, well, not quite no astronomers, but nearly no astronomers. So with that, we now introduce this third star of our show. The third star of our show is Edwin Hubble. Edwin Hubble. Now Hubble, like Shapley, had been born in Missouri, and his father was an attorney who worked in the insurance business as an underwriter. His mother, Virginia James, who they called Ginny, again another nickname, was related to Jesse James, the outlaw. So Hubble is related to Jesse James, his mother's son. Now, Hubble's father, John, was a pretty tough guy in the sense of trying to get around. He was very puritanical, very strict. He insisted that Hubble study things that were going to be profitable adventures. He thought astronomy was, I guess, like being a lead guitar player in a hair band. Not something to aspire to. And so Hubble was always unable to quite make his dad happy. And that affected him. Now, as he's growing up, you think that Hubble would have been very successful. He was tall, he was 6'2" or more. He was athletic, he was a 3-letter man in high school. He was smart, got top grades, and he was very good looking. But somehow he just never could quite put it all together. So, after high school, he enrolls at the University of Chicago, studies law to keep his father happy, does astronomy on the side, and he's recommended to Hale for a position here. But he says, no, I've got other things I've got to do first, the war effort. So he joins the Army, and he goes from the rank of private to captain in 4 months, and eventually becomes a major. Now, while he was in college, he had earned a Rhodes Scholarship, full ride to Cambridge. And while he gets there, again, studying the law, astronomy on the side, and while he's there, he falls in love with the English. He thinks the English are just the greatest thing that ever was. So he starts wearing the tweeds and the knee pants and the deerstalker cap and smoking a pipe. And this guy from Missouri starts speaking with an English accent. He was, in a word, a twit. Completely dysfunctional. But he was brilliant and terrific observational astronomer. So after he goes to the Army, he becomes a major. He's given a company of 600 men, 25 officers. He goes to Europe, and now he's Major Hubble, but he never sees action. But he says he does. Hubble often said that he did things that he didn't do. Seems to be a common problem. So after he finishes his time in the military, he comes here and he insists that everybody call him Major Hubble, and he continues to speak in his English accent. Drove Shapley crazy. So, Hubble decided that he's going to study what are called spiral nebulae. They're now called galaxies. The spiral nebulae. What are they? How far away are they? How do they work? Are they gas? Are they star? Not well known. So on October 6th of 1923, he makes this image. H335H. And this, again, is a star image. Everything that's black is a star. Everything that's white is the background. He worked on making this. The original for this, by the way, maybe 3.5 by 4.5. It's quite small. So he's looking at this plate, as he does. He examines every plate very carefully with microscopes, measuring instruments. And he sees 1, 2, 3 stars he hasn't seen before. He knows this object really well. He's been photographing it ever since he was a kid. So he goes back and looks at old plates. He makes new plates and he figures out, yep, these 2 stars, which he marked in for nova, are in fact novas, blowing up stars that came and faded. This star's been there before. So he makes more plates and makes more measurements and builds graphs. And he figures out this is a Cepheid variable star. So he crosses out N and writes VAR exclamation point in red. He has discovered a variable star in M31 Andromeda Galaxy, what we now call the Andromeda Galaxy. But he doesn't publish right away. Instead, he continues to observe and finds 14 Cepheid variables in this structure and publishes in 1924, where he asserts, based on his measurements and observations using the inverse square law, that this object is about 800,000 light years away. Way bigger than Shapley's estimate, which was too big, of the Milky Way galaxy. So this is not part of the Milky Way galaxy. So he now goes and looks at multiple other spiral nebula, finds Cepheid variables in them, and begins to calculate distances. Now he needed an instrument of this strength and this capacity in order to be able to see individual stars in it. You can see this object even with a naked eye in the right conditions. But with an amateur telescope, it's visible. It's a fuzzball, but it's visible. But to see individual stars is a big challenge. Now, separate to that, at Wilson Observatory in Arizona, an astronomer named Vestos Slipher was making observations using a 24-inch refracting telescope, way inferior to this one. And he was doing spectroscopic studies, and he was very, very good at it. And as he's making spectroscopic studies of spiral nebulas, he figures out that some of them have the bands of the elements in the right place, but they're in the right order, I should say, but in the wrong place. Some of them are shifted to the blue, some of them are shifted to the red. So he makes that, and he assumes, based on the principles that Christian Doppler had figured out with sound, that if a waveform is coming towards the viewer, the wave shortens and the pitch rises. If the waveform is moving away from the viewer, the wavelength lengthens and the pitch drops. But he didn't know the distances. So Hubble, without giving credit, uses Slipher's data and figures out that not only have we discovered the universe, but we've discovered the universe is expanding. That those galaxies that are moving towards the red are moving away from us, and that the farther away they are, the faster they're moving, which creates the basis for the Hubble constant, the number of which is continually being updated. So, starting with Henrietta Swan Leavitt, figuring out distances using Cepheid variables, and then going to Hubble, mankind discovered the universe. And then instead of being on one star of a billion stars in the galaxy, our galaxy is one of a trillion galaxies. And human beings become even less intelligent. The best we can do is treat each other with kindness. So with that, I'm going to go and take, actually I want you to form a line right here. We've got to look in the mirror. Then you can take your pictures, then we'll go outside and I'll do an epilogue.